Her bare feet, raw and bleeding, were the least of her worries. Behind her, the unforgiving canyons echoed with the guttural laughter of the bandits she'd just escaped. Ahead, the merciless Arizona sun promised only a slow, agonizing death from thirst. This was not the life Elara Hayes had envisioned when she'd left the smog-filled skies of Philadelphia. Her heart filled with the hopeful words of a man she'd never met. She was supposed to be a wife, a partner in building a dream on the frontier. Instead, she was a fugitive, hunted and alone. And the man who could save her promised Groom. She believed he was already 6 feet underground, the victim of a tragic accident. But in the unforgiving West, the dead don't always stay buried, and the most dangerous lies are the ones you're forced to live. The rhythmic clatter of the locomotive was the heartbeat of Elara Hayes' new life. For 6 days, it had been her constant companion, a percussive symphony, carrying her away from the predictable, suffocating gentility of Philadelphia and towards the vast, untamed promise of the Arizona Territory. She clutched the small tintype photograph in her hand, its edges worn smooth for countless hours of study. Thomas Stone. Even his name felt solid, dependable. In the photograph, he stood tall beside a half-finished corral, the sun squinting his eyes just so. He wasn't handsome in the way of the clean-shaven city gentleman she'd left behind. His face was all angles and sun-weathered lines, a road map of a life lived under an open sky. A thick moustache shadowed a mouth that in his letters had written words of such surprising tenderness and shared vision that they had captured her imagination completely. "I am not a man of fancy words, Miss Hayes," he had written in his first letter, his script strong and clear. "I am a rancher. My hands are calloused and my days are long. But I have tamuled acres of land that the good Lord saw fit to put under my care, a burgeoning herd of cattle and a belief that a life built with an honest partner is the most valuable thing a man can possess. I cannot offer you ballrooms, but I can offer you sunrises that will steal your breath and a partnership built on mutual respect and hard work. I have enclosed my photograph, though it does little justice to the land itself, which is the true beauty here." Elara, trapped in her role as the unmarried 24-year-old ward of a distant aunt, saw not a gamble, but an escape. She saw a chance to be more than an ornament. She craved the scent of dust and sagebrush, the satisfying ache of physical labor, the quiet intimacy of building a life from scratch beside a man who valued respect over refinery. The train hissed to a halt, jolting her from her reverie. A sign, its paint peeling under the relentless sun, announced her destination: Serenity Springs. The name was a stark, almost cruel irony, set against the backdrop of the rugged, ochre-colored mesas that clawed at the sky. She gathered her modest luggage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She smoothed the wrinkles from her navy traveling dress, a futile gesture against the dust that had already claimed it. Stepping down from the carriage, the heat hit her like a physical blow. It was a dry, oppressive force that shimmered above the dusty main street. The town was a collection of raw timber buildings, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors from which spilled the tinny notes of a piano, a sheriff's office, and a smithy. She scanned the faces on the platform, weather-beaten men in dusty hats, a few weary-looking women in sun-faded calico. There was no sign of the man from the photograph. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Had he forgotten? Had he changed his mind? "Miss Hayes." The voice was smooth, cultured, a stark contrast to the rough surroundings. She turned to see a man who could have stepped right out of a Philadelphia drawing room. He was dressed in a tailored suit of fine grey wool, impossibly clean in this dusty world. His dark hair was pomaded, his face clean-shaven, and he held a black bowler hat in his hand. He was handsome, with dark, sympathetic eyes. "I am," Elara said, relief warring with confusion. "But you are not Mr. Stone." The man's smile was gentle, tinged with a profound sadness. "No, ma'am, I am not. My name is Marcus Thorne. Thomas he was my partner, and my dearest friend." The past tense hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Elara whispered the word, barely audible. Marcus Thorne's gaze dropped to the dusty boards of the platform. He took a deliberate breath, as if steeling himself to deliver a blow. "Miss Hayes." "Elara." There is no easy way to say this. There was an accident. A terrible accident 2 weeks ago. Up in the north pasture, a rock slide. Thomas. He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The world tilted on its axis. The heat, the dust, the distant piano, it all faded into a roaring in her ears. The photograph in her hand suddenly felt like a shard of ice. This couldn't be. The letters, the promises, the meticulously planned future, it couldn't all dissolve into dust on a train platform. "No," she said, shaking her head in denial. "No, there must be a mistake. I received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago. He was excited for my arrival." "He was," Marcus affirmed, his voice a soothing balm of sorrow. "He spoke of nothing else. That's what makes this all the more tragic. He was checking a fence line near the old mesas, preparing everything for you. It was a freak occurrence. The sheriff, Eli Vance, he led the recovery. There was nothing to be done." Tears streamed down Elara's face, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a ghost. She was utterly alone, a stranger in a land that already felt hostile and alien. Marcus stepped closer, his presence a shield of concerned civility. "I promised Jed I would look out for you if anything ever happened to him. A promise I intend to keep. You cannot stay here alone. It is not safe. My home is just outside of town. It is large, and you would be my honored guest. Please allow me to offer you some shelter, some comfort in this terrible time." His offer was a lifeline in a maelstrom of grief and panic. She could barely think, let alone formulate a plan. Nodding dumbly, she allowed him to take her luggage. As he led her towards a handsome carriage, she glanced back at the town of Serenity Springs. The name now seemed like a mocking epitaph for a life that had ended before it had even begun. Marcus Thorne's kindness was the only glimmer of light in a suddenly dark and terrifying world, and she clung to it with the desperation of a drowning woman. She had no idea that the hand she was holding was the very one that had pushed her under. Marcus Thorne's home was an oasis of startling civility on the edge of the wilderness. It was a 2-story timber frame house, painted a crisp white, with a wide, shaded porch and green shutters, a piece of the East transplanted into the rugged heart of Arizona. Inside, the floors were polished wood, the furniture was dark and heavy, and the air was cool and still. It was a world away from the sun-baked dust of Serenity Springs. For the first week, Elara existed in a fog of grief. Marcus was the perfect host, a paragon of gentle sympathy. He ensured she had everything she needed, spoke to her in hushed, comforting tones, and shared fond, carefully curated anecdotes about Thomas that painted him as a brutal but perhaps reckless friend. He loved this land, Ilara, Marcus would say, swirling a glass of brandy as they sat in his well-appointed study in the evenings. But he never truly respected its dangers. I warned him about that north pasture, especially after the spring rains. He was too eager, too driven, especially with you coming. He wanted everything to be perfect. It all seemed so plausible, so tragic. Ilara mourned the man she'd never met, the future that had been stolen. She wrote a long, tear-stained letter to her aunt, explaining the horrific turn of events, though she knew there was no comfort to be had from that quarter. She was, for all intents and purposes, stranded. Marcus offered her a solution. "You are educated, well-spoken," he said one evening, his dark eyes earnest. "I need help keeping my ledgers managing correspondence for my business affairs. I would be honored if you would accept a position as my assistant. It would provide you with a respectable income, a purpose. You need not rush back to a life you wished to escape." Grateful and adrift, she accepted. The work gave her a focus, a routine that dulled the sharpest edges of her sorrow. She managed his accounts, which seemed to be varied and prosperous, involving land speculation, water rights, and of course his partnership in the ranch he had supposedly shared with Thomas. But as the weeks turned into a month, the fog of grief began to thin, and the sharp clarity of her new reality began to emerge. Marcus's kindness started to feel less like charity and more like ownership. He discouraged her from going into town alone, insisting the environment was too coarse for a lady of her standing. He would fetch her necessaries himself. When she expressed a desire to visit Thomas's grave, he put her off, claiming the local cemetery was a depressing, ill-kept place, and it would be better to remember him as he was. A creeping unease began to settle in Ilara's bones. She started to notice small things. The way the townsfolk she did encounter, the blacksmith, the general store owner's wife, would offer her pitying looks that seemed to hold something more, something like fear. Their conversations would become clipped and evasive whenever Marcus was near. The Sheriff Eli Vance was a particularly unnerving presence. He was a tall, lean man with pale, watchful eyes and a quiet authority. When Marcus introduced them, the sheriff's gaze on Ilara was sharp and searching. "A tragedy, what happened to Jed Stone?" Sheriff Vance had said, his voice a low drawl, his eyes never leaving hers. He was a good man, solid, knew this land like the back of his hand. The emphasis was subtle, but Ilara felt it. A man who knew the land so well. Would he be so easily caught in a rock slide? The first real crack in Marcus's story appeared by accident. Ilara was tasked with organizing his study, a room he usually kept locked. He was away for the day meeting with investors in a neighboring county and had entrusted her with the key. In a large roll-top desk, tucked away in a mislabeled drawer marked Geological Surveys, she found a leather-bound ledger. It was not for business. It was a personal journal. Thomas Stone's journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The script was the same strong, clear hand from the letters. She felt a pang of guilt of intrusion, but a stronger, more urgent instinct drove her on. She flipped to the last few entries. April 12th. Thorne is pushing again about the Black Creek Pass. He wants to buy out my share of the water rights. Says the cattle are a slow return and the real money is in selling water to the railroad when they come through. I told him no. This land is for raising life, not for carving up and selling, piece by piece. He looked at me in a way I did not like. A hunger in his eyes. It was not the first time. April 16th. Met with Sheriff Vance in town. Told him about Thorne's pressure. Eli is a good man, but he said without proof of a crime, it's just a business dispute. He told me to watch my back. I intend to. The photograph of Miss Hayes arrived with the mail. Lord, she is even lovelier than I dared hope. There is a strength in her eyes. I feel like the luckiest man in the territory. Just a few more weeks. April 21st, the final entry. Thorne rode out this morning, said he had business in Prescott. Something feels wrong. He was too agreeable when I told him again the water rights were not for sale. Said he would ride with me tomorrow to check the fences in the north pasture to bury the hatchet. I pray I am just being foolishly suspicious. I must not let this cloud the joy of Elara's impending arrival. Elara's blood ran cold. He was going to the north pasture with Marcus. The story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lie. Thomas had been afraid of his partner. He had suspected him, and Marcus had placed himself at the scene of the accident. She slammed the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The polished floors, the fine furniture, the cool, still air. It was all the trappings of a gilded cage built by a monster. That evening when Marcus returned, his charming smile did nothing to hide the predatory glint in his eyes that she could now see so clearly. He seemed to sense a change in her, a new tension in her posture. "You seem quiet tonight, Elara," he said, pouring them both a drink. "Just tired." She lied, her voice tight. He moved closer, his proximity no longer comforting but menacing. "I have been thinking. We have observed a proper period of mourning for my friend. But life must go on. You and I, we work well together. We understand one another. You are a woman of refinement, and I can offer you a life of comfort and protection. Elara, I want you to be my wife." It was not a proposal. It was a command. The offer of marriage was not one of love, but of consolidation. He wanted Thomas's ranch. He wanted Thomas's water rights. And now he wanted Thomas's intended bride, the final piece of the stolen life he was assembling. Elara looked into his dark, expectant eyes and saw her future laid bare, a prisoner in this beautiful house forever bound to the man who had murdered her hope. She knew then that she couldn't stay. She couldn't expose him. She had no proof that would stand up against a man of his influence. The journal was her word against his. She had only one option. She had to run. "Marcus," she said, forcing a small, hesitant smile. I am honored. I need some time to think. It is all so sudden." He accepted her answer, confident in his control. "Of course, my dear. Take all the time you need." That night, Elara lay awake in her four-poster bed, listening to the house settle. She didn't have time. She had until dawn. She looked at her sturdy traveling boots by the door and knew they would make too much noise on the wooden floors. She had to leave everything behind, with only the clothes on her back and Thomas's journal clutched to her chest. She waited for the moon to dip behind the mesas. Then, holding her breath, she slipped out of her room, a ghost in a house of lies, and ran barefoot into the terrifying unknown darkness of the Arizona night. The moment Elara's bare feet touched the cool, dusty ground outside Marcus Thorne's house, the enormity of her decision crashed down upon her. The night was not silent. It was alive with the chirping of crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, and the whisper of a dry wind through the sagebrush. Every sound was a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place for a new terror. She ran not towards the faint lights of Serenity Springs. Marcus would look for her there first, but away from it, towards the dark, looming shapes of the mesas and the untamed wilderness. Thomas's journal, tucked into the bodice of her simple cotton nightdress, was a hard, reassuring weight against her skin. It was the only truth she had left. The ground was a tapestry of torment. Soft dust gave way to sharp, loose gravel that bit into the tender soles of her feet. She stumbled over rocks and cried out as the spines of a prickly pear cactus raked across her ankle. Panic was a wild animal clawing at her throat, urging her to run faster, but her body was already screaming in protest. She had been a woman of soft shoes and paved streets. The unforgiving terrain of the desert was skinning her alive. By the time the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and grey, she was miles from the White House, but hopelessly lost. Every direction looked the same, a brutal expanse of rock, sand, and thorny vegetation under a vast, indifferent sky. Her feet were a bloody mess of cuts and deep bruises. Thirst was a physical ache in her throat, a sandpaper rasp with every breath. She huddled behind a cluster of boulders as the sun began its ascent, a malevolent orange eye that promised to bake the very moisture from the air. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her nightdress and tried to clean the wounds on her feet, hissing in pain. She was a fool, a city fool who had run from a cage straight into a coffin. What had she hoped to accomplish to find? What justice safety out? Here there was only survival, and she was failing miserably. She pushed on, driven by a primal will to live. The sun climbed higher, beating down with a physical intensity. The world became a shimmering, distorted haze. Her thoughts grew disjointed. She saw Marcus's smooth, smiling face, then Thomas's from the tintype, his eyes squinting in the sun. She spoke to him in her delirium. You shouldn't have trusted him, Thomas. He had a hunger in his eyes. Late in the afternoon, when she was on the verge of collapse, she saw it. A thin curl of smoke rising from behind a low ridge. Hope, sharp and desperate, surged through her. People. Water. She scrambled towards it, her movements clumsy and weak. She crested the ridge and looked down into a small hidden arroyo. A campfire burned, and around it were 4 men. They were rough, bearded, and heavily armed. Their horses tethered nearby were lean and mean-looking. This was no friendly prospector's camp. The stench of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey and wood smoke drifted up to her. Her heart plummeted. She had stumbled from the frying pan directly into the fire. Before she could retreat, a twig snapped under her bruised foot. One of the men, a hulking figure with a greasy beard and a single milky white eye, looked up, his gaze locking onto hers instantly. "Well now, Silas," he grunted, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "Look what the desert wind blew in." The other men turned. The one called Silas was clearly the leader. He was leaner than the others, with a wiry strength. His face was a mask of cold intelligence, his eyes black and sharp as obsidian chips. He looked her up and down, taking in her torn nightdress, her wild hair, and her bloody feet. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cold, calculating assessment. "Where'd you come from, little bird?" Silas Kane asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Fallen from a nest?" Elara was too terrified to speak. She tried to back away, but her legs refused to cooperate. 2 of the other men were already scrambling up the slope towards her. They grabbed her arms in bruising grips, their laughter coarse and cruel as they dragged her down into the camp. She struggled, but it was like a mouse fighting a pair of wolves. They threw her onto the ground near the fire. She landed hard, the impact jarring through her exhausted body. She curled into a ball, trying to protect herself as they loomed over her. "Ain't got no shoes," one of them cackled, prodding her bloody foot with the toe of his boot. Elara flinched away. Silas Kane knelt in front of her, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. His touch was like ice. "You're a long way from anywhere. You running from someone or to someone?" When she didn't answer, his grip tightened. "It ain't polite not to answer, Missy. Now you got a name, Elara." She choked out the name, a betrayal. "Elara," he repeated, tasting the name. "A fancy name for a half-wild thing we find in the dirt. You see, Elara, my boys and I, we were just on our way to collect a final payment for a job we did. A job that involved making a fella disappear up near Serenity Springs. Tell me, little bird, what does a pretty thing like you know about Serenity Springs?" Elara's blood turned to ice. It couldn't be a coincidence. A job that involved making a fella disappear. These were the men. These were the men who had murdered Thomas Stone under the guise of a rock slide. The men Marcus Thorne had hired. She stared into the face of Silas Kane, into the eyes of one of her Groom's killers, and saw not a glimmer of humanity. She had escaped the architect of her misery, only to fall into the hands of his brutal, blood-soaked tools. The desert, she realized with sickening finality, was not the thing that was going to kill her. They were. While Elara was enduring the first hours of her captivity, a man was watching the sun set from a hidden cave carved into the face of a remote canyon miles to the north. His body was a tapestry of mending wounds. A long, puckered scar ran along his hairline, a permanent reminder of the rock that had glanced off his skull. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest, the bones in his forearm still knitting together. But he was alive. Thomas Stone was very much alive. He remembered the day with a fragmented, nightmarish clarity. Marcus, his face a mask of false friendship. The ride to the north pasture. The way Marcus had kept looking up at the unstable scree slope above them. The sudden sharp betrayal in his partner's eyes just before he'd spurred his horse away. And then the thunderous roar. He remembered a fleeting, searing pain, the crushing weight, and then darkness. He should have died. By all rights, he was buried under 100 tons of rock and shale. But the slide had been imperfect. A small overhang of granite had created a pocket, a tiny void in the chaos of the rockfall. It had saved him from being crushed, but had left him trapped, bleeding, and with a broken arm. He'd lain there for what felt like an eternity, drifting in and out of consciousness, his throat raw from shouting. He was found not by the sheriff's posse, a search he was sure Marcus had deliberately misdirected, but by an old Apache man named Taza, who used the hidden canyons as his hunting grounds and had seen the unnatural dust cloud from miles away. Taza had known the old ways. He had dug Thomas out not with a shovel, but with patience and an understanding of the rock. He'd taken him to this hidden cave, set his arm with splints made from yucca stalks, and treated his head wound with a poultice of herbs that had fought off the infection. For weeks, Thomas had hovered in a feverish state between life and death. Taza had tended to him, sharing his meager food and water, speaking little but communicating a sense of quiet, stubborn life. During his recovery, Thomas's grief had curdled into a cold, hard rage. Marcus hadn't just tried to kill him, he'd tried to erase him, to steal his land, his future, and the woman who was supposed to build it with him. The thought of Elara Hayes arriving in Serenity Springs, alone to be met by his murderer, was a torment worse than any physical pain. He imagined Marcus oozing sympathy, spinning his web of lies. Would she have believed him? Would she already be gone, returned to the east? Or worse, had Marcus, with his slippery charm and considerable wealth, somehow trapped her the day he was finally strong enough to stand? He'd thanked Taza a debt he knew he could never truly repay. The old Apache had simply nodded, gesturing to the south. The coyote thinks he is the hunter, but the mountain lion waits, Taza had said, his voice like stones grinding together. Be the mountain lion? Thomas had made his way cautiously, living off the land as Taza had taught him. He'd observed his own ranch stone's throw from a distance. He saw Marcus's men riding his fences, Marcus's brand being burned over his own on new calves. The rage burned hotter. He was a ghost haunting his own life. He needed information. He couldn't just walk into Serenity Springs. Marcus had money and influence. Thomas Stone was legally dead. He'd be called an imposter, a madman, and likely end up in a cell or the ground before he could speak a word of truth. He began to move on the fringes, listening. He learned from a lone prospector that Marcus Thorne had taken on a new assistant, a pretty little thing from back east, who had come to marry Stone. So Elara was there. Trapped. The knowledge was both a relief and a terror. His focus shifted. He knew Marcus couldn't have managed the rock slide alone. It was too precise. He'd have hired professionals. And in this part of the territory, that meant one man, Silas Kane, a ruthless bandit leader known for taking any job if the price was right. Thomas began to hunt for signs of Kane's gang, knowing they were the key. They were the physical proof of Marcus's crime. Meanwhile, in the bandit camp, Elara's life had become a waking nightmare. The men were brutes, their casual cruelty a constant threat. But she learned quickly that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. After the initial terror, a cold, defiant core began to form within her. She was no longer just Elara Hayes, the hopeful bride from Philadelphia. She was a survivor. She made herself useful, a tactic for self-preservation. She could cook better than any of them, and a well-fed brute was marginally less aggressive. She tended to their small injuries with a knowledge gleaned from household medicine books, her touch firm and impersonal. She learned to read their moods, to make herself small and unnoticeable when the whiskey flowed too freely. Her focus was Silas Kane. He was the most dangerous, but also the most intelligent. He was the one who spoke of the final payment from Thorne. One night, huddled by the fire, she listened as he spoke to his white-eyed deputy, a man they called Jeb. "Thorne's getting jumpy," Jeb grumbled. "The wire from Prescott said he wants us to clear out of the territory for good once we get the last of the silver. Says things are complicated." "Complicated how?" Silas asked, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The blade scraped rhythmically. "His little mail-order bird flew the coop," Jeb said with a nasty chuckle. "Ran off into the desert a few nights back. Barefoot, they say. Thorne's got his men looking for her, but it's like she vanished. He's worried she might have found something, knows something." Silas stopped sharpening his knife. He looked over at Elara, who kept her eyes fixed on the stew she was stirring, her heart pounding. His black eyes narrowed in a long, speculative stare. His little mail-order bird. "Well, well, Jeb," Silas said softly, a cruel smile touching his lips. "It seems our luck has changed. Thorne's complication just became our collateral. Our final payment just got a whole lot bigger." Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She was no longer just a captive. She was a bargaining chip, a piece of leverage in a deadly game between two villains. Her value had increased, but so had her peril. Days later, as he shadowed the canyons bordering Thorn's land, Thomas found the tracks he'd been searching for. Not the clumsy tracks of Thorn's ranch hands, but the distinctive shod prints of 5 horses moving with purpose. He followed them, his movements silent and patient, the lessons from Tarza guiding his every step. He was no longer Thomas Stone the rancher. He was the mountain lion, and he was closing in on his prey. The tension in the bandit camp had grown taut as a guitar string. Silas Kane was waiting for the right moment to play his new card, and his nervous energy made the entire gang edgy. Elara felt it like a change in barometric pressure, a storm gathering just over the horizon. She maintained her quiet, subservient routine, but her mind was racing, searching for any chance, any sliver of an opportunity to escape. She knew that once Silas made his move and contacted Marcus, her life would be measured in hours. Thomas, meanwhile, had been tracking the gang for 2 days. He moved like a spirit through the canyons, using the terrain for cover. His rage honed to a fine, sharp point. He was one man against Finn with only one good arm. A direct assault would be suicide. He had to be smarter. He had to be what Tarza had called him, a mountain lion. Patient, silent, and lethal. He found their camp at dusk, nestled in the same hidden arroyo where they had captured Elara. He crawled to the edge of the ridge, his heart stopping for a beat as he saw her. She was alive. She was thinner, her face smudged with soot, her movements weary. She was stirring a pot over the fire, her expression a careful, neutral mask. But the sight of her, the woman from the photograph, the woman who had haunted his fever dreams, sent a jolt of protective fury through him that eclipsed all his pain. He saw the way the men watched her, the casual menace in their postures. He saw the cold, proprietary gaze of Silas Kane. He also saw Thomas's journal, which Kane had taken from her, and was idly flipping through, sitting on a rock near the fire. The proof. Thomas retreated from the ridge, his mind working furiously. He couldn't wait. He had the element of surprise, and the encroaching darkness was his ally. Down in the camp, Silas Kane closed the journal with a snap. "All right, Jeb. Ride out at first light. Head for the old Tillman place. Send word to Thorn. Tell him we have his property. The price is double, and he delivers it himself. No tricks." "And if he says no?" Jeb asked. Silas glanced at Elara. "Then we send him a piece of his property as a reminder of the cost." A wave of nausea washed over Elara. This was it. The countdown had begun. As full darkness fell, Thomas began his assault. It was not a charge of guns blazing. It was an attack on their resources, on their minds. Using a small pouch of oil he carried, he crept towards their tethered horses. His movements as silent as the night wind. He slicked the knot on their lead rope, loosening it just enough. Then he moved to the opposite side of the camp upwind. He took a deep breath and let out a sound that Tarza had taught him, the terrifying, guttural scream of a cougar defending its territory. The sound ripped through the quiet night, primal and close. The men in the camp jumped to their feet, grabbing their rifles. The horses, already spooked by the scent of a predator, panicked. They reared back, pulling against the oiled rope, which gave way instantly. With terrified whinnies, the 5 horses galloped off into the darkness. "Damn it, find them!" Silas roared, furious at the breach of security. 3 of his men, including Jeb, plunged into the night after the horses. That left Silas and one other man, a heavy-set brute named Cletus, in the camp with Elara. This was the chance Thomas had created. He circled around, entering the arroyo from the far side, using the deep shadows cast by the fire as his cover. He moved with a predator's grace, his one good hand clutching a heavy piece of firewood he'd picked up. Cletus was nervously peering into the darkness, his back to the center of the camp. Elara, seeing the commotion, had instinctively moved away from the fire, closer to the shadows where Thomas was now hiding. With 2 silent strides, Thomas was on Cletus. He brought the log down hard on the back of the man's head. Cletus crumpled without a sound. Silas spun around at the soft thud, his hand streaking to the pistol on his hip. He saw the crumpled form of his man, and a tall, broad-shouldered figure rising from the shadows. The firelight flickered across the stranger's face, illuminating the angry scar on his hairline and the cold fury in his eyes. Silas Kane's blood ran cold. He had seen that face before, staring up at him from the rubble, pale and lifeless. It was impossible. Stone. He breathed the name a curse. You're dead. You should have buried me deeper. Kane. Thomas's voice was a low growl, filled with all the pain and rage of the past months. He held the bloody log like a weapon. The dead don't bury themselves. He charged. Silas, recovering from his shock, fired his pistol. The shot went wide, the bullet screaming off the rocks as Thomas lunged, tackling him to the ground. It was a brutal, desperate fight. Thomas, with only one good arm, was at a disadvantage, but he fought with the strength of a man who had already died once. He rained blows down with his good fist, driven by the image of Elara, of his stolen life. Elara, frozen for a second, in sheer heart-stopping disbelief, was galvanized into action. The man from the photograph, the man she had mourned, the man she had come here for, was alive. He was here. He was fighting his own murderer. She saw Thomas's journal lying by the rock where Silas had dropped it. She snatched it up. Then she saw Silas pinned under Thomas, reaching for the knife in his boot. "The knife!" she screamed. Thomas saw the glint of steel and rolled, avoiding the desperate upward thrust. He grabbed Silas's wrist with his good hand, their arms locked in a deadly stalemate. "Elara, run!" Thomas grunted, his muscles straining. But she didn't run. She looked around wildly, and her eyes landed on the heavy, cast-iron skillet she had been cooking with. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, lifted it high, and brought it down with all her might on Silas Kane's head. The clang of iron on bone was sickening. Silas's eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Silence descended on the arroyo, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged, heaving breaths of 2 people who should never have met. Thomas pushed himself off the unconscious bandit, his entire body screaming in protest. He looked at Elara. She stood there, holding the skillet, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, impossible hope. She was trembling, covered in dirt, her feet wrapped in rags. But in the flickering firelight, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He took a step towards her, then another. He didn't know what to say. The letters, the plans, they all felt like they belonged to another lifetime. "Elara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She could only stare at the face from the tintype, now flesh and blood, and scarred but unmistakably him. "But Marcus said, you were dead." "Marcus Thorne is a liar and a murderer," Thomas said, his gaze intense. "And I'm the man you came here to marry. I'm Thomas Stone." In that moment, standing over the body of their common enemy, surrounded by the vast and hostile wilderness, two strangers bound by a lie and reunited by violence finally met. The promised life of quiet partnership was a distant dream, but a new, fiercer bond had just been forged in the crucible of survival. The return of Silas Kane's men was not the panicked rush Thomas had anticipated. They came back in ones and twos, cautiously having failed to round up the spooked horses. Thomas and Elara were ready. Hidden in the rocks above the camp, they watched as the bandits discovered their unconscious leader and their dead compatriot. The ensuing confusion was their chance. Under the cover of the chaotic argument that broke out among the remaining three, Thomas and Elara slipped away into the night. Their journey back towards Serenity Springs was a slow, painful ordeal. Thomas, still weak from his injuries, and the brutal fight leaned heavily on Elara, and Elara, her bare feet, now wrapped in better bandages made from Silas's own shirt, found a strength she never knew she possessed. They moved in silence at first, the reality of their situation too immense for words. He was no longer the idealized man from the letters, and she was no longer the naive bride from the East. They were two survivors, scarred and battered, bound by a shared trauma. They stopped to rest in a sheltered overhang as the moon climbed high. Thomas finally broke the silence. "The journal," he said, his voice raspy. "You have it." Elara pulled it from her bodice and handed it to him. "He took it from me when they captured me." He was reading it. Thomas clutched it, the tangible proof of his life and Marcus's betrayal. "He told you I was dead." It wasn't a question. "On the train platform," she whispered, the memory still sharp. "He said it was a rock slide. He was so convincing, so kind. He took me in. I lived in his house. I worked for him." The shame and foolishness of it washed over her again. Thomas's good hand clenched into a fist. That was his plan all along. To kill me, take my ranch, and then take my wife. To steal my whole life. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and a deep, unexpected tenderness. What he put you through. What they put you through. "Elara, I am sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for, Thomas," she said, her voice finding a new firmness. "We were both his victims, but we are not anymore." In the cool desert night, they shared their stories. He told her of the betrayal, the rock slide, and his rescue by the old Apache Taza. She told him of the gilded Cossack in Marcus's house, her growing suspicions, and the barefoot escape into the desert that had led her to his murderers. With every word, the strangers from the letters faded, replaced by the real complex people sitting beside each other. A new kind of intimacy was being built, not on promises of a peaceful future, but on the shared reality of a violent past. They arrived at the outskirts of Serenity Springs just after dawn, avoiding the main road and circling around to the one place Thomas knew he could find a true ally, the sheriff's office. Sheriff Eli Vance was sitting at his desk nursing a cup of coffee when the door opened. He looked up and his jaw went slack. He saw Elara Hayes, looking like she'd been through a war, and beside her a man he and the whole town had pronounced dead and buried 2 months ago. "Thomas," the sheriff breathed, rising slowly from his chair. "By God, is that you?" "It is Eli," Thomas said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "And I've got a story to tell you." For the next hour, The sheriff's office became a nexus of revelations. Thomas and Elara laid out the entire conspiracy, from Marcus's desire for the water rights to the hired killers and the gilded imprisonment. The final irrefutable proof was the journal. Thomas opened it to the last page and laid it on the desk. Sheriff Vance read the entry, his face grim. He looked from the journal to Thomas's scarred face, to Elara's battered feet. The pieces he'd been unable to fit together, his own suspicion of Thorn, the man's sudden wealth. The strange disappearance of the new bride all clicked into place. "I knew it," Vance said, his voice a low growl of anger. "I never believed that story about the rock slide. Not for a man like you. But I had no proof." He looked at them both. "Now I do." The confrontation was not a shootout in the street. It was something far more satisfying. Sheriff Vance, with Thomas by his side and Elara as his witness, walked directly into Marcus Thorne's office at the Land Speculation Company. Marcus was in a meeting with two well-dressed investors from back east. He looked up, his face a mask of polite inquiry that dissolved into sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at Thomas, as if he were seeing a spectre risen from the grave, his face draining of all color. "Stone," he stammered, his composure shattering completely. "It can't be. You should have made sure Marcus—" Thomas said, his voice cold and steady. "Marcus Thorne," Sheriff Vance announced, his voice booming through the office. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for the attempted murder of Thomas Stone and the kidnapping of Elara Hayes by your hired accomplices." Marcus's investors stared, mouths agape. His entire world, built on a foundation of lies and murder, crumbled in that single moment. He tried to protest, to call them insane, but the sight of Thomas alive and accusing, and the cold certainty in the sheriff's eyes, broke him. His downfall was swift, public, and absolute. The news spread through Serenity Springs like wildfire, and the townsfolk who had once offered Elara pity now looked at her with awe and respect. Days later, Thomas and Elara stood on the porch of the ranch house at Stone's Throw. His ranch house. It was small and rustic, nothing like the grand home Marcus had built. It smelled of pine wood and leather and dust. It smelled real. The legal matters were being handled by the sheriff. The remaining members of Kane's gang had been rounded up. Marcus Thorne was facing a federal judge. For the first time, the future was their own. It was an awkward, tentative peace. They were bound by a contract and a crime, but they were still strangers in the most fundamental ways. "It's not what I promised you in the letters," Thomas said quietly, looking out at the vast expanse of his land. "Life here. It's hard. I'm not sure it's the life you wanted." Elara looked not at the land, but at him, at the lines of exhaustion and pain around his eyes, but also the unyielding strength. She thought of her old life, of the suffocating stillness of Philadelphia. She had come west, seeking a partnership and a purpose. She had found them, just not in the way she had ever imagined. "The life I wanted was an honest one, Thomas," she said softly, "with a partner I could respect. It seems to me that's exactly what I've found." She gestured to the east, where the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in breathtaking colors, just as his letters had promised. "You didn't lie about the sunrises." He looked at her, a slow smile finally reaching his eyes, chasing away some of the shadows. "No, ma'am. I reckon that's the one thing everyone can count on out here." They stood together on the porch, not touching, but closer than they had ever been. They were not the star-crossed lovers of a fairy tale. They were two survivors, looking out at a new day. The path ahead would be difficult, but they would walk it together. Their partnership forged not by ink and promises, but by fire truth and the shared quiet strength of having walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged barefoot and battered into the light. The story of Elara Hayes and Thomas Stone is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken, a powerful reminder that truth can rise from the deepest graves, and that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of taking one more step, even when your feet are bleeding and all hope seems lost. They were brought together by a lie, but bound forever by the truth they fought to uncover. Their shared journey through the dust and deception of the Arizona Territory shows us that the strongest partnerships are often forged in the hottest fires. If their incredible story of survival and justice moved you, please honor their legacy by giving this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who appreciates a real-life drama where heroes are forged, not born. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more lost tales from history to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one. What part of Elara and Jed's ordeal did you find the most compelling? Was it the escape, the rescue, or the final confrontation? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. Thank you for listening, and until next time, ride safe.